Hi, this is Dr. Carlos Yebra López,
And this is Dr. Usman Chohan.
and we just dropped Critical Polyglot Studies, the first systematic and critical analysis of polyglots, polyglossia, and languages, now available including an open access chapter number 3 about the polyglot industry.
Looking forward to your feedback and your comments. Welcome again. This is part 3 of the interview between Dr. Usman Chohan and Dr. Carlos Yebra López on the new book that has come out, Critical Polyglot Studies. And in this part 3, we are covering what the remedial activity we have done is, what this book is, what Critical Polyglot Studies means. We're going to use the acronym CPS, Critical Polyglot Studies. That is the title of the book, and that is the essence of the book. And we want to explain what this book offers against what you have heard in parts 1 and 2 about a certain community, a certain industry, and a certain matrix that govern how we think about polyglossia so far, and what we offer in exchange for that as an alternative, something worth listening to. So welcome, Carlos, and I'm going to open by saying, what is Critical Polyglot Studies, point blank?
Thank you, Usman. Critical Polyglot Studies is a subdiscipline of critical social linguistics. What do we mean by this? Linguistics up until the mid-20th century was dominated by two main paradigms, structuralism and generativism. And structuralism began with this distinction between langue and parole. Langue is a system of language, understood methodologically, and parole is the practical uses of languages, understood specifically, as opposed to the abstraction of langue. Both structuralism and generativism focused on langue, thus forgetting about parole. And then you have social linguistics beginning in the 60s and the 70s. And within social linguistics, you have more emphasis on what? The societal aspect, right? As the name indicates. And you can distinguish between two paradigms: variationist social linguistics and critical social linguistics. Variationist social linguistics was very disruptive because it entailed, amongst other things, the idea that Afro-American vernacular of English was just as legitimate as any other dialect of English. And based on the ideas of López and Routledge, it argued that variation is at the core of language. It's not something extrinsic, alien, or extraordinary or exceptional vis-a-vis language, but it's actually at the heart of how language works. However, ultimately, variationist social linguistics analyzed parole to go back to langue, to go back to systematizing languages. So based on this variation, this is the whole system of how this language works, right? Critical social linguistics says no. Listen, langue is parole and parole is langue. That binary does not actually exist. It serves no purpose and it actually obfuscates many of the aspects of how language works. So you can think of critical polyglot studies as an extension of critical social linguistics applied to polyglossia, understood as the serial acquisition of languages. We problematize that understanding of polyglossia based on this critical background. And we do so with a certain ontology, epistemology, methodology, and political economy. And I can break those down for you, of course.
Absolutely. So let's start. What we're saying here is that we have offered something as CPS. It falls within linguistics, it falls within sociolinguistics, falls within critical sociolinguistics, and finally get to critical polyglot studies. That is how you should frame it. Yeah. Let's begin with the ontology, because we may have a non-expert audience, although in our book we do this very rigorously because we're presenting something new to a highbrow audience. For a general audience, what is ontology in the sense we are referring? What is the mainstream polyglot ontology? And what is our answer to that critical polyglot studies ontology?
Yes, so ontologically, we adopt critical realism. How is this different from mainstream polyglot studies? In mainstream polyglossia, we assume that languages, polyglossia, and polyglots are obvious, self-evident realities, apropos which an objective knowledge is possible, maybe necessary, right? Languages are, Korean is a language, Spanish is a language, and that's it. Then you learn Korean, you learn Spanish, and you're a polyglot. Yeah, easy, right? We say not so fast, not so fast. Languages, polyglots, and polyglossia are not self-evident realities. They are also discursively constructed, meaning people come up with all sorts of understandings and representations of those entities, languages, polyglots, and polyglossia. For instance, the way they represent them in YouTube videos, the way they represent themselves in conferences. All of those are acts through which we portray languages and polyglots in a certain light. The other end of the spectrum is saying, look, this is all fake. There are no polyglots, there are no languages, polyglossia is a scam, right? That's called discursive ontologism, thinking, okay, it is all representation, it is all discourse, it is all marketing. There's nothing to this. We place ourselves halfway between these two extremes. That's why it's critical realism. We agree with naive realists that languages, polyglots, and polyglossia exist, but we disagree that there can be an objective knowledge about them, and these are self-evident realities. We agree with discursive ontologists that there is certain marketing to polyglossia, languages, and polyglots, but we say that doesn't mean that everything, the whole thing is fake and we need to forget about it. It's all a scam. We say, no, there are languages, there are polyglots, there is polyglossia, it's just not in the way it has been traditionally defined, right? So that's critical realism. That's the ontology. Right. And everything follows from that. Everything else is consistent with that. So the epistemology is a skeptical epistemology. What does that mean? It means there cannot be an objective knowledge, hence epistemology, about languages, polyglots, and polyglossia. We're always skeptical about supposedly objective representations of these. So when people say in a video, this is the truth about polyglots, this is the truth about language, well, actually, no. I don't really care what you argue. We already agree that there is no such thing as the objective truth about polyglots and polyglossia and languages, so I don't even need to watch the video. Once you adopt that position of naive realism, I already know that your position is flawed. And then we have a methodology. Our methodology is what some academics have called immanent critique. So in immanent critique, we don't seek to elucidate the truth about polyglossia or polyglots or languages. We've already said that we are epistemologically skeptical. We don't believe there is such thing. Instead, what we do is to analyze the inconsistencies, the contradictions that exist in people's representations of languages, polyglots, polyglossia. When people say, I speak 5 languages, how many do you speak? We take that and we do an immanent critique. We say, okay, what are the contradictions and the nonsense that we can detect here? First, languages as countable, polyglot matrix, dismantle that. Second, you are comparing your putative number of languages to my putative number of languages, neoliberal individual ethos of competition. We also talk about that in the book, etc. Right? So we don't seek to elucidate the ultimate truth about polyglots, languages, and polyglossia because we don't believe that is possible in the first place. Instead, we point out flaws, contradictions, and inconsistencies in people's discourses about these entities. And we also expose oppressive practices. If we see an economic disparity in the way people access languages, some people can participate in conference, others can't. Is there a problem there? Can we change that? If we see there is a gender gap in participation because women on average are have less proclivity to show in a video or participate in person as opposed to communicate by text, how can we fix that? So we also aim at dismantling systems of oppression that are taking place in the material sphere, as well as theoretical inconsistencies that are taking place in the representation of polyglossia, polyglots, and languages.
So now we have discussed the ontology and the epistemology, right? We are talking about critical realism. We're talking about immanent critique. These are techniques on which CPS is based, and they're very valuable because you start to look at polyglossia with fresh eyes, and it's pretty cool. Let's take a step back now. There are 2 forces which shaped polyglossia, which we have not yet mentioned, but they had a huge deal. And because we have a certain political economy in CPS, let's talk about ethno-nationalism, let's talk about neoliberalism, And then let's talk about what we consider to be the appropriate form for CPS in terms of political economy.
Right. Yes. So as you said, we discussed the ontology, which is critical realism, the epistemology, which is skepticism, and the methodology, which is the immanent critique. And now we have left the political economy, right? So first, you pointed out two sets of rationalities: neoliberalism and ethno-nationalism / neo-colonialism. So these are two sets of rationalities. Some authors speak about rationalities. I prefer to speak of sets of rationalities because it's not easy to single them out. But the main idea is that languages in the West, since the very beginning, have been framed from the perspective of ethno-nationalism and neo-colonialism. For instance, think about the difference between a language and a dialect. What is a language and how is it different from a dialect? Well, a language is a dialect with an army behind, right? What does that mean? It means with the power of the state behind. That's what it means. So the very idea of language is already mediated by ethno-national and colonial rationalities. And so is that of dialect or patois or anything that is defined by opposition to a proper modern language. Have you noticed that not everything counts as a modern language? Even if it's spoken nowadays, because it's not a time category, it's an ethno-national / neo-colonial category. That's what we need to understand. That's why modern languages department and universities are changing the names for world languages as we advocate in the Polyglot Matrix chapter, because they themselves realize the discrimination that is implicit in that neo-colonial / ethno-national paradigm. And then you have the neoliberal rationalities, which are about the capitalistic economic exploitation in our neoliberal society. And that's when hyperpolyglossia comes in. Hyperpolyglossia is a very recent phenomenon that started in the 21st century, but it didn't fall from the sky. It does not operate in a vacuum. It comes directly from the economic exploitation of language capital. So I want to accumulate languages to then create a YouTube video, to then create a YouTube channel, and then a company to sell products and ebooks to make money on the basis of my linguistic quote-unquote skills. That's hyperpolyglossia, right? And that's why it's complicated. And here I want to preempt an objection, because some people might be wondering, well, if hyperpolyglossia is so toxic, then why do you use hyperpolyglot in Hypia or in the hyperpolyglot activist? If there are no languages as self-evident realities, why are you talking about people speaking one language or several languages? Here you have to make a distinction between the congruent use of a term and the strategic use of a term. When we use these terms, polyglossia, polygloss, hyperpolyglossia, languages, we always use them in the book in between inverted scare quotes, meaning these are not to be taken literally. The minute you take them literally, you have already participated from the matrix. You have already consented to those being putatively objective realities. Yes. Right? So when we're making reference to hyperpolyglossia, we're making reference to that because we know our audience has a certain understanding of it, and we want to take that understanding and put it upside down, dismantle it. Right? So we're playing judo with those notions. It's not because we believe in the currency of those congruently. Again, our use of these terms is strategic, it's not congruent.
Now, let's delve a little bit more into this, because there is something neo-colonial and it requires emphasis. What is it that we are talking about? And also what requires emphasis is the neoliberalism. For example, they tell you learning languages, it's good. You can put it on your resume and you'll look better in the job market where you sell your labor. You have to build videos and you know these languages, and so you can sell your products. This is a very big taboo. And once you start to expose this on the way towards the critical aspect of critical polyglot studies, you open a can of worms, because you realize how dominant neo-colonial / ethno-national as well as neoliberal elements are in this. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because that's what was really emphasized in chapters 2 and 3.
Absolutely, and all of these aspects act in sync, in synchronicity. When you are applying for that job which you refer to, what does the job ad look like? Well, it says native speakers are preferred. Where does that come from? See, it's the capital exploitation, therefore neoliberal rationalities, of an ethno-nationalized conceptualization of languages, implying native and non-native speakers, which is a what? A colonial neo-racist category. It's not an empirical description. It's an ideological one with pernicious implications. That's why in countries such as the UK, you cannot publish a job ad asking for native speakers, for instance, right? So it's not only inaccurate and ideologically pernicious, it starts being illegal in some countries, as it should. As it should. So yeah, all of these aspects work in sync. And just going back to your question, so what do we suggest as regards our political economy? If we don't believe in ethno-nationalism/neocolonialism, if we don't believe in neoliberalism, what do we believe in? And we posit decoloniality from a political perspective and anarchism from an economic one. I'll leave to you the intricacies and depths of anarchism, since you're an economist by training. But there is a certain family resemblance between anarchism on the economical side and decoloniality on the political side. So decoloniality is different from post-coloniality and coloniality in what sense? Coloniality is the political relationship of dependency between what? A metropole and the colony, right? Say Spain and Mexico, when Mexico was part of the territories of New Spain, right? Now, once Mexico gains independence from Spain, that relationship is no longer colonial, but that doesn't mean that there is full cultural independence. So post-coloniality is a relationship of cultural dependence after political independence has been gained. So Mexico is independent from Spain, but that doesn't mean people in Mexico stop speaking Spanish all of a sudden, right? So that's the post-colonial relationship. And the decolonial one has to do with rejecting both political and cultural dependence, which is premised on the ability to self-organize, which relates to anarchism as an economic model.
Okay, so well, if you asked me, well, anarchism fundamentally means no masters, and I have been an anarchist. IPO was born from anarchist principles, and you have no masters, which means that you are slapping this neoliberal rationality in the face, because what you're doing is mustering and marshalling economics resources towards mutual aid. You're doing so in a manner that is independent, towards common good, towards things that don't have the profit motive as the ultimate and final goal. You are not hoarding the means of the production or the consumption. There is a totally different conception of things from the ground up. This has a 200-year history as we understand anarchism, and you got to read the book as well as my previous work on anarchism to understand how powerful this is. I am a devout person in terms of anarchism, and I see this as the way forward for it, and it hybridizes very well with your point about decoloniality. So in terms of political economy, as with our ontology, methodology, and epistemology, we offer something very powerful, I believe. But now I ask you, if all of this coalesces into something called critical polyglot studies, this ontology, epistemology, methodology, and political economy, then I ask you, why is this so novel and so awesome? What's the big deal here with critical polyglot studies?
I think the main idea that it advances is emancipation. I think that the value of critical polyglot studies is double. First, it maps out and it helps us understand the systems of oppression, be them material or ideological, under which polyglossia, languages, and hyperpolyglossia have been conceptualized. And this has never been done in the case of polyglossia, let alone hyperpolyglossia. So it's 100% originally. Hence why it's a necessary book. It's not a book that participates from neoliberal requirements or in academia, as in, say, getting tenure. We've already taken care of that with other books. So now we're writing what we need to be written, what needs to be written, which is critical polyglot studies. So again, it's the first book that maps how the polyglot industry works, how the polyglot matrix works, how the polyglot community evolved into the partial devolution into that polyglot industry matrix, and how it is struggling to remain detached from it. That's the first thing. Second thing is, it actually proposes a way forward. it contains programmatic points. It contains its own ontology, epistemology, methodology, political economy. We've already talked about that. And then it contains programmatic points, and then 2 initiatives that partially instantiate those programmatic points, but that we also subject to a critique. Because this book is not about, it's not a PR job. It's not about public relationships. It is a truth-seeking endeavor. And that means having a look at the mirror and say, listen, I have these and these and these and these and these flaws. And this is how I can fix them. So anybody who encounters criticism of themselves and see themselves reflected in a not so positive light in some of their aspects has to first read our criticism of our own initiatives and then understand, okay, I've been held to a same standard that they themselves hold their own initiatives to.
Exactly right. So that's why we have to give this caveat right here, right now, that those who may feel unease with reading aspects of this should first realize that this is from a place of goodwill, and that you won't believe how much we have criticized what we ourselves have built, because that is the spirit of criticality, and we aren't casting aspersions per se. It's not in a place of bad faith. It is that we want to make this a freer system, the emancipation ideal that you put, and we criticize ourselves way more than we criticize anybody else, because that's the whole point of making things better. And this emancipation point that you brought is very powerful, because you've correctly said that this ain't the book that's going to get us tenure, because that's not what we're interested in. This is the book that had to be written for the sake of it being written. It's out of passion. This is totally different. I mean, I work in a totally different dimension, and then to work with you on this gave me a kind of liberation. Otherwise, like in the Matrix, why oh why didn't I take the blue pill? Right?
Listen, if the aliens came today and they said, we have to kill you, Carlos, but you can leave something behind, just one item, I will leave this book.
That's what I'm talking about.